Alex Dono of Locked On ACC and Locked On Canes. The shoot for the moon, land in the stars. That analogy is what I get from the Big 12 and it being leaked that Florida State and Clemson, internally at least, the conference expects to add those two schools within the next year. Does this send out a flare to Miami, to Louisville, to Virginia Tech, to NC State, to the teams, the schools that the Big 12s have been rumored to have contact with? Does this show them, hey, wait a second, the Big 12 doesn't play? Could this be a PR move that's set to add those schools instead of the dream scenario of Florida and Clemson?
Yes, if those schools aren't at least exploring the options. And I know when I say that, fan bases from all the schools you mentioned be like, wait, we don't want to be in the Big 12. Right. If they're not at least exploring every possible option, I believe it's administrative malpractice, right? You need to be exploring that because whether or not the ACC exists in a few years, it's not going to look the way it looks right now because at some point, Florida State and Clemson are getting out. It's a matter of when, not if. It's going to happen. So the idea of not doing your due diligence and exploring the possibility of, and obviously any of the schools you mentioned would probably, at least the way the landscape currently looks, would prefer to be in the Big Ten or the SEC. They're not handing out bids to everybody. Right. It's not feasible. Right. We're talking about maybe the Big Ten getting up to 20, possibly adding 2 more members. The SEC has been pretty quiet with expansion recently. So it's not like they're just handing out bids to everybody, at least exploring the idea of, hey, the Big 12 with new revenue sources coming in, the potential for private equity, like you mentioned, and a more flexible TV contract than what the ACC has, because the ACC essentially has no power over their TV deal until 2036. So, yes, I think it would be wrong for any of these schools not to at least explore the option of, hey, if the Big 12 is interested, let's at least hear what they have to say.
For the Brett Yormark era of the Big 12 conference, does a guy like that, from the standpoint of someone who covers the ACC, does a guy like that scare you? After you saw what happened with the Pac-12, there was no remorse in the Big 12 taking 4 schools. Do you feel like from the outside that Yormark is the kind of commissioner that's not afraid to rip apart the ACC if it means the life of the Big 12?
That's a great point because if I'm on the other side of that, I would be afraid because Yormark, he is very aggressive in a way that the ACC and ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips does not appear to be. Yormark is a much better showman. Now, me and Kenton Gibbs, we talk about this all the time on Locked On ACC, that it seems like Jim Phillips, who's the ACC Commissioner, it seems like he's an okay commissioner, but he's a terrible showman. And I think part of doing that job is you have to be a good showman. You have to be aggressive. I'm not really sure yet how aggressive Jim Phillips is. I will be at ACC Media Days next week, so maybe I'll get a better idea based on what he has to say there. But I think it's very obvious from where I sit that even if his master plans may not all succeed, Yormark's clearly his mission is to try to turn the Big 12, into something that can contend with the SEC and the Big Ten. Whereas I don't get those vibes from the ACC. I think the ACC is more like, hey, let's try to stop the bleeding, right? There's a hole in the ship. Let's try to plug that up. Like, they're not thinking, how can we become a powerhouse? It's like, how can we survive? How can we kind of maintain a little bit of momentum? So on the other side of that, yeah, I would be afraid because Yormark seems to be pretty ruthless and pretty aggressive.
Dono, I'm going to give you this 2 very recent scenarios here, and I want to know where the ACC fits. Look at what the Pac-12 did. You lose your top couple programs, then from there you just lose, and you fall apart. The Big 12, 4 years ago, lost Texas and Oklahoma. And instead of falling apart a la Pac-12, you added 4 new members, you changed commissioners, you not only found a way to stay alive, but you became stronger, arguably stronger in many ways, rather than dying off. Do you feel like the ACC at this crossroads is more similar to where the Big 12 was 4 years ago or where the Pac-12 was last summer?
I would like to think that they're a little closer to where the Big 12 was. And I think it's because the ACC, they did learn some lessons from what happened to the Pac-12. Now, I don't really agree with the additions that they've made. I think SMU can add value. Dallas market, it's an up and coming program, really rabid donation base. I mean, you know that area even better than I do. But the Cal and Stanford additions, I'm very kind of lukewarm on that. I think there were maybe other options out there they could have added that would bring more value than than Cal and Stanford, but at least like the ACC is showing you they're willing to make additions if they feel like that's going to help them. And I do feel that if and when Florida State and Clemson get out of the ACC, they would look at further expansion. Now, you're not going to find anyone who has as much value as the teams you're about to lose. That's obvious. But I think a possibility of adding, an up and coming program in Florida like USF could add some value. You still have Oregon State and Washington State just kind of hanging out there, hoping for a lifeboat. So I think the ACC would probably be able to avoid complete death the way that, what happened to the Pac-12. But, I think the big fear from an ACC point of view would be, even if you survive, do you fade to a point where what you're offering no longer resembles a power conference? I think that would be the concern. I think the ACC will survive. I just don't think they will thrive.
Putting your Jim Phillips hat on, what do you then say to a Miami, to a Louisville? When we talked about the 7 schools that were at the forefront of this and discussed what it would look like to leave the ACC. If you're the commissioner, how do you take those brands and keep them in conference? What can the ACC offer that the aggressive Big 12 couldn't match?
See that? I don't know what they could offer that the Big 12 couldn't match, but I'll tell you what Jim Phillips would probably tell these remaining members. He would remind them, hey, we still contractually have a college football playoff tie-in where if you win this conference, you are guaranteed to be a top 5 seed in the CFP. I know that's really one of the few things that is holding this conference together, that as long as you, for the next several years, you contractually have that tie-in, you're guaranteed a college football playoff berth if you win the conference. That's one thing. And then the other thing that the ACC, they instituted this last year as a way to try to satisfy Florida State and Clemson. It obviously didn't work. But they have, at least not fully, they have adopted a performance-based financial model where you do earn, if you represent the ACC in the college football playoff and you achieve certain winning thresholds on the field, you do make a larger share of revenue. So it's not a strict even revenue split. Now, that wasn't enough to satisfy Florida State and Clemson, because what Florida State, especially Clemson's less loud about all this stuff. Florida State has been a lot louder about their complaints. What Florida State wanted was, hey, okay, I guess it's nice that you pay us based on performance, but what we really want is to be paid based on how many eyes we bring to the sets, how much revenue we produce. That's what the ACC wouldn't go that far. They're not going to do the split based on the revenue you bring in, but they have readjusted their revenue split based on performance. And I think that would be something they would come back with, like, hey, and also, let's not forget this. When Florida State and Clemson leave, there's going to be some kind of a buyout. They're going to haggle over whether it's, 150 million or 500 million, whatever it is. There's going to be some kind of a buyout. They're then going to redistribute that money to the remaining schools. So that will be a financial incentive for staying in the ACC. So I think between that, the reminder of the college football playoff tie-in, I think the ACC can and should do a much better job of marketing their programs. Their social media presence is pretty weak compared to some of the other conferences. So that's something they need to work on, but they're going to do whatever they can to try to convince these schools, hey, if you stay here, it's not so bad. That's going to be their pitch.
Coming up, can the ACC stay alive? Let's go into a more detailed dive over how this conference will keep kicking on Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, I get it. It's the middle of July, right? Rent's not coming up yet, but for me, I'm all in. MLB All-Star Game, there are lines for that stuff. Home Run Derby, I think it was last night, there were lines for that stuff. And at FanDuel, when baseball comes back after the All-Star break, you can love sports at an even different level, because at FanDuel.com right now, there are boosts and bonuses daily. You go in and say, Cole Reagans. I don't even really know who Cole Reagans is. I think he pitches for the Royals. I'm not positive, but I do know that he strikes out a lot of guys. And when I see at FanDuel that I can get 9 strikeouts at plus 200 and put $20 on it to make $40, I do it. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Go to FanDuel.com. Start making the most of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of the MLB.